Hello everybody and welcome to lecture 24. This is fertilization, implantation, and pregnancy. Okay, so to start we'll talk about maturation of sperm. So sperm matures in the epididymis of the male. Okay, so they're produced in the testes, then stored in the epididymis, and in the epididymis the process of maturation means they're going to actually gain motility. They'll have enhancement of their metabolic activity and machinery. They'll develop these species-specific receptors on its surface that are capable of binding to the zona pellucida of the oocyte. And the zona pellucida is a glycoprotein structure that surrounds and protects the oocyte. And it'll also have these inhibiting factors that cover over these receptors to protect them and also to help stabilize the membrane of the sperm. We say stabilize because when we get to capacitation, all right, destabilization of the membrane can result in a sort of a cascade of events. So after ejaculation, the sperm within the female reproductive tract undergo capacitation. So the environment of the female reproductive tract is conducive for this process and helps to trigger it. So what happens is it loses that membrane stability that I just mentioned. And due to that, it actually becomes more porous to, say, calcium. So calcium, there's an initial calcium influx. And this initial calcium influx, one thing that it triggers is an increase in motility. In addition, this can also trigger the removal of inhibitors on those receptors that are on the surface and a redistribution of some of these receptors, some of them internal and so on, moving to the external surface. And so this now makes the sperm ready to actually bind to the zona pellucida. And you can see in the cartoon to the right here. So this is, I have it here. There we go. So in the epididymis, you can see the little yellow T symbols there, which represent these receptors, and then they're surrounded by, all right, these sort of stabilizing factors that cover over those receptors, which you can kind of see that it's coded in red there. And this is added by the seminal fluid that comes along with the ejaculate. And then in the female tract, again, that environment's conducive to removing those stabilizing factors, destabilizing the membrane a little bit, allowing that calcium influx and so on. Now, once the sperm actually makes contact with the zona pellucida of the oocyte, we have what we call an acrosomal reaction. So there's going to be receptors that bind to that zona pellucida, all right? Influx of calcium, so this is the second time we're having an influx of calcium. The first time was to increase calcium to increase motility. But this influx is going to release enzymes, like hydrolytic enzymes, from its acrosome. Now, the acrosome is on the very surface of the head of the sperm. And so it releases these enzymes and starts to hydrolyze the material of the zona pellucida. And also, in addition, will also increase the motility still further. So it's essentially pushing harder through the zona pellucida as it's trying to hydrolyze the glycoprotein matrix that makes up the zona pellucida. Now, for fertilization to occur, the receptors on the sperm have to bind to the receptors on the ovum. So once it's made its way through that zona pellucida, it'll have receptors that recognize the receptors on the ovum or the oocyte. And the change in so what happens once it binds to that receptor, there's going to be a change in the membrane potential and the receptors of the oocyte, and calcium influx occurs in the oocyte this time. So we talked about two calcium influxes, both within the sperm. This is a calcium influx within the oocyte, and this calcium influx prevents any additional sperm penetration. So this prevents any other sperm that might be also hydrolyzing the zona pellucida and binding to the oocyte from being able to actually penetrate into the oocyte. So it basically releases and hardens that zona pellucida, which can help prevent that. Now, in addition, once this first sperm has made its way through, the haploid nucleus, remember that's only containing 23 chromosomes from the male, it's going to enter into the oocyte, and then the oocyte at that point will complete its meiosis 2. So remember that it was locked in meiosis 2. It'll complete its meiosis and get rid of a very small polar body, which it'll eject from the larger oocyte. And now this haploid chromosomes from the sperm join with that of the oocyte, okay, and then they form the zygote. So in this cartoon, what you're seeing is the sort of generalized acrosomal process here. So at point number 1, you can see the sperm makes contact with the egg, and you can see the sort of the green highlight on the head of the sperm there. That's the acrosome. Okay, that specialized structure that contains some of these enzymes. So the receptors bind to the zona pellucida, then you get that acrosomal reaction that I was talking about. So in step number 2, acrosome reacts with the zona pellucida, releases its hydrolytic enzymes, and it kind of burrows its way through that zona pellucida. And then number 3, the acrosome reacts with what we call the perivitellin space. Now I didn't mention the perivitellin space yet, but that's really just the space here. Let me draw it for you. So in this region right here, that yellowish region, this is really the space between the oocyte and the zona pellucida, and so they call it the perivitellin space. Okay, so it reacts with the perivitellin space, so it's coming into there, and it's going to bind to the receptors on the oocyte. So the plasma membrane of the sperm and the egg are going to fuse at that point once those receptors bind to each other. And again, that's going to initiate that cascade that I was mentioning before, where calcium influxes into the oocyte and causes a change in its membrane potential, and essentially ejects some of what we call these cortical granules. So there's these granules that are just beneath the surface of the oocyte there, and so they get released, as you can see over here. They get released into that perivitellin space, and it actually causes the perivitellin space to swell and pushes the zona pellucida outward, and some of the compounds also cause the zona pellucida itself to harden. So all this is protective and prevents any other sperm from being able to penetrate at that point. And then once bound, the sperm nucleus, all right, is going to enter into the oocyte, and it carries that haploid number of chromosomes. The oocyte will then undergo finish its meiosis II, and then we have the haploid from the oocyte combining with the haploid chromosomes from the sperm. And then you see down here, number 6, the cortical granules fuse with the egg plasma membrane, which renders the vitellin space impenetrable to sperm. So that's part of that reaction that I was talking about earlier. Okay, so now, so that's the process of the sperm actually combining with the egg, being able to drive through that zona pellucida, perivitellin space, binding to the oocytes, and then we have fertilization and the formation of our zygote. So now if we step back a minute, we can see how or where this takes place, right? So again, the oocyte, from previous lecture we learned that oocyte is ovulated from the ovary. And you can see over here, here's the ovary, and you see the oocyte gets ovulated there, and it enters in through the fallopian tube, or the uterine tube, and the fallopian tube has these finger-like projections, these fimbriae, that help to kind of pull that oocyte into the fallopian tube. And in fact, fertilization takes place after ovulation, right? And it takes place usually early within the fallopian tube. So the sperm has actually had to travel through the vagina, to the cervix, into the uterus, and then into the fallopian tubes, and it's traveled that distance to the ovulated egg within the fallopian tube. Once that single sperm has then penetrated through the process we talked about, that egg is going to be moving all the way through the fallopian tube via smooth muscle contraction action, as well as cilia, these finger-like projections on the surface of the cell that beat. So a beat in one direction, what happens is that's going to carry the egg through this fallopian tube. And while it's being carried towards the uterus. And as it's happening, the cell is going to divide and continue to divide, okay? And as it's dividing, what we're going to have by the time it reaches the uterus, after about 5 days, is what we call a blastocyst. All right, where we can see there's like a little cluster of cells inside here, and then there's a layer of cells around it, and a fluid body right there. I refer to this as the blastocyst. And so it has been dividing multiple times, and it's being carried by smooth muscle action and the cilia towards the uterus. And this, again, this takes anywhere from about 3 to 5 days. Okay. Now, once it reaches the uterus, then it can embed, or what we call implant, into the uterine wall, which has been being prepared prior to the ovulation due to the hormonal actions of estrogen and progesterone. So it has been growing, increasing in size and glandular tissue, and tissues that will ultimately be able to support this growing blastocyst. Okay. Now, a couple things with estrogen progesterone. So first off, once it's ovulated, we know that estrogen levels are high, and estrogen one of its functions in the body is to increase smooth muscle activity and excitation. So that causes contractility of the smooth muscles. This is actually what helps to drive the egg along the fallopian tube. Okay, now progesterone starts to pick up, all right, because it's part of that luteal phase. All right, so the corpus luteum starts to produce more and more progesterone, and it takes a couple days before the progesterone levels start to become more significant. And progesterone has the opposite effect on smooth muscles than estrogen does. And so progesterone actually relaxes the smooth muscles in the fallopian tube. By the time it does that, though, again, we're already pretty much here at this junction here where there's the opening between the fallopian tube and the uterus. And then actually there's a sphincter there, and it helps to relax those smooth muscles of the sphincter, and that allows the blastocyst to move in. So the timing of that is pretty important. So that's why I say progesterone takes over several days later to help relax that smooth muscle at the end there. Now, in terms of the implantation, once it's made into the uterus, all right, and implants into the uterine wall, into what we call the endometrial layer of the uterus, all right, so remember that blastocyst has that inner cell mass. So you can see that over here, the inner cell mass. All right, so that's already going to be our developing embryo. That inner cell mass is going to become the embryo. The outer cell mass, all right, so the outer cell mass, all right, that's going to be out here, at this portion there, okay. That outer cell mass, that's what we call the trophoblast. All right, this is going to be the future membrane, the future membranes and the future placenta, okay. And it forms something called the syncytial trophoblast. All right, so you can see that over here, syncytial trophoblast. And this is essentially these cells that bind to the endometrium of the uterus, and they kind of coalesce to form a very large cell, and they start to invade into the endometrial tissue. And as soon as it starts to break into that endometrial tissue and interact with the tissue that's been forming there, some of the supportive cells of the endometrium, it starts to release human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG, commonly used as the indicator for pregnancy. So that starts to be released as soon as it embeds. Progesterone as well, estrogen, and human chorionic somatomammotropin, or HCS. So this is like sort of like lactagen. So this is something we'll talk about each one of these hormones individually. But again, once it embeds there, it's going to start producing those hormones. Okay. But at this early of stage, okay, we still are reliant, okay, on the corpus luteum to continue to support the endometrial lining. So it has to continue to secrete estrogen and progesterone to maintain the support of that endometrial lining, so for the growing embryo. All right, so in terms of the hormones that are going to be released now by this developing embryo, you have human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. Commonly, that's the hormone that's used in pregnancy tests. So you can do urine pregnancy test, or if you want to detect it even earlier, like in a couple of days, you could detect that with a blood sample. Okay. So this, again, secretion immediately after implantation, and again, measured several days after implantation if you're doing a blood test. Usually the urine tests take longer than that. And the HCG, it mimics luteinizing hormone, or it acts like LH. And this is important because this is what maintains the corpus luteum in the first place. So as the corpus luteum, again, that lasts for about 14 days. And if there's no fertilization, the corpus luteum then involutes, all right, becomes inactive. What happens is that's stimulated by luteinizing hormone. Okay, so it has a lot of high density of luteinizing hormone receptors. What happens though over that 14-day period, if there's no fertilization, the estrogen and progesterone continue to inhibit luteinizing hormone's release until ultimately there's not enough luteinizing hormone to support it, and then ultimately involutes. And then once you lose the estrogen and progesterone, you can't support the endometrium. However, if there is fertilization and we have implantation, that HCG will then act like the luteinizing hormone. And so what that does is that maintains the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum will continue to secrete progesterone and estrogen, which is vital for maintaining the pregnancy. Okay, so stimulates that corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum will also secrete relaxin in response to that. And relaxin, we'll talk about some of that function in a few minutes. All right, the HCG also stimulates the fetal testes, if it's a male, to secrete testosterone, and secretes secreted rapidly and increasing concentration to the end of the first trimester. So what that's saying is, in that last bullet point, is that HCG levels are absolutely necessary in the first trimester. Okay, in that first trimester, we're really talking about the first 3 months. And during that first 3 months, you'll see that HCG grows up pretty rapidly. And then once it's basically there to maintain the corpus luteum so that we can maintain that progesterone and estrogen levels. At which point, the estrogen, at the end of the first trimester, once the estrogen and progesterone levels are sufficiently high and being produced by the placenta now, all right, by the syncytial trophoblast that turned into the placenta, now that can maintain the growing fetus or the growing, the embryo, and the corpus luteum is no longer needed. So here are the hormone levels, which you can see here. In green, you'll see the human chorionic gonadotropin. All right, so you see those levels, they peak. And again, they peak really just before the 12-week period, which is about 3 months of your first trimester. And you see that, so that peaks. You'll also notice the gradual increasing of estrogen and progesterone. So it continues to peak, and once it starts to come down, really we're at a level of estrogen and progesterone that can maintain the pregnancy in the uterine wall there. So that's why it starts to decline. Now it doesn't go all the way back down. You can see here that it's still higher levels, all right, than non-pregnancy, but it drops significantly as the estrogen and progesterone continue to rise. And you can see the estrogen and progesterone, essentially, they continue to rise for the duration of the pregnancy until birth, which is what we refer to as parturition. Okay, so we're going to talk about estrogen. So I talked a little bit about the function of estrogen already in terms of it increases smooth muscle contractility and motility. We saw that in the fallopian tube. In the endometrial lining of the uterus, it helps to develop those cells and prepare them for implantation. Okay. Now, as we've seen, estrogen increases gradually throughout the entire pregnancy. All right, and so it has multiple roles that it has to fulfill for the developing fetus and for the mother in preparation. Now, in the first 12 weeks, the corpus luteum was required to produce that estrogen, right? And it's also releasing progesterone. And so, initially we release that, or the embryo releases the HCG, stimulates that corpus luteum to produce the estrogen. After the first trimester, the placenta takes over. Now, a couple things about the placenta. The placenta requires a healthy fetal adrenal gland in order to make estriol, which is the primary estrogen that placenta makes. And so that's going to take over and start to produce more and more estriol. Now, the reason it requires it is it lacks an enzyme that we talked about in my adrenal gland lecture. All right, a little PTSD for you guys. All right, 17-alpha hydroxylase. If you recall, again, estrogen is a steroid. It's cholesterol based, and so it's going to have to take in cholesterol, modify it, and it needs the enzymes to do that. But it lacks 17-alpha hydroxylase, which means it can't convert pregnenolone or progesterone. It can't convert those into DHEA. So placenta does have these LDL receptors, so it can take cholesterol in and it can make pregnenolone or progesterone. So that's what you're seeing down here in the cartoon. So cholesterol can produce pregnenolone and progesterone, but then it lacks this 17-alpha hydroxylase and can't produce the DHEA, which should be the next step in order to produce estrogens. So what happens is that can get shuttled, as you can see over here, gets shuttled to the fetal adrenal gland. The adrenal gland has the enzymes to pull that off, so it makes the DHEA, and that can get shuttled back to the placenta. And once the placenta has the DHEA, it has the enzymes to convert DHEA into estrogens, like the aromatase enzymes and so on. So it's able to finish the job. So there has to be talk between the placenta and the adrenal gland. Now, in addition to that, the fetal liver over here can actually produce its own cholesterol, can send that cholesterol directly to the fetal adrenal gland. So the fetal adrenal gland is capable of producing the adrenal hormones that we've talked about. Now, the last thing here, before I move on from this, is it can produce that estradiol and estrone over here, but the main product from the placenta is estriol. And so what happens is this product of estradiol and estrone, it can get moved back into the fetus, where the estradiol and the estrone goes to the fetal liver, and then can get converted to estriol. So enzymatic activity within the liver converts that to estriol, which goes to the placenta and then gets ultimately excreted from the placenta into the maternal circulation is estriol. So estriol is the primary estrogen found during pregnancy. Now, in terms of some of the other functions of estrogen during this time, during pregnancy, the mother's uterus will become larger and more compliant to accompany with the developing fetus. The external genitalia would enlarge, and also development of the breasts. So the adipose tissue and the glandular ducts and so on, they'll start to develop as well in preparation for breastfeeding. Okay, so progesterone is also going to be released from the placenta, again, primarily after the first trimester because the corpus luteum is needed in the beginning. The estrogen and progesterone levels do suppress FSH and LH. So estrogen and progesterone will both inhibit FSH and LH, which helps prevent any further ovulation from occurring during this time. Now, in terms of progesterone's effects relative to estrogens, when it comes to the myometrium, or the muscle of the uterus, estrogen, as I've already spoken of, has an increase in excitability on smooth muscles. So, for example, it was increasing contractility in the fallopian tubes. All right. Estrogen levels will also increase contractility of the myometrium of the uterus, which is the muscular, smooth muscle layers of the uterus. It can do the same thing in the smooth muscle of the vasculature, so cardiovascularly speaking. So that's one of its primary functions. Progesterone goes up along with estrogen, and it's important because progesterone's effects, which when they go up together, progesterone predominates. So the effect of progesterone predominates over estrogen in this regard. So what ends up happening is progesterone on smooth muscle causes it to relax. So progesterone's actions are the opposite of estrogen's. So what happens is now the progesterone levels, as they're going up, they'll predominate over the smooth muscles and cause more relaxation, which is what you want because you don't want early contractions of the uterus. So the progesterone keeps the myometrium of the uterus relaxed. We saw that in the fallopian tube, it relaxed the fallopian contractions. And it'll do the same thing on smooth muscles of the blood vessels. It'll help those to relax as well to reduce some of that resistance. Okay, so that's important to remember in terms of the contrast to estrogen. Now, this helps to prevent premature childbirth and menstruation as well because it helps to maintain the endometrial lining, just like estrogen. So they work together there. Prevents the contractions, which also helps to prevent childbirth. It also promotes the proliferation of decidual cells. Now, this is part of the actions that it has in promoting the health of the endometrium, are these decidual cells. Decidual cells, the endometrium. So these decidual cells have large glycogen stores and so on. So a lot of energy can be derived from them and used by the growing and developing fetus. Okay. Stimulates development of the acini in the breast, but suppresses milk production. So just like estrogen, again, sometimes they work together, sometimes they're opposite. Here, they're going to work together in development of the breast tissue in preparation for breastfeeding. And they'll actually increase the release of prolactin. All right, and prolactin is what produces milk. So it increases the production of the prolactin, or the release of prolactin, but it inhibits the milk production within the breast itself. So it's developing the breast, but preventing any kind of milk production. All right, so that won't occur until after the pregnancy. And what I mean won't occur, what I'm saying is milk production won't occur until after the pregnancy, once the estrogen progesterone levels subside. Now, placental human chorionic somatomammotropin. It's a mouthful, all right? It's also called human placental lactogen, as I mentioned a few slides ago. And so this is being produced by the placenta as well. It helps the development of the mammary glands, so it works in conjunction with estrogen and progesterone in that fact. All right, has anti-insulin properties. So these are valuable because it's going to increase and mobilize carbohydrates and fat stores since there's a large energy requirement now for the mother and for the fetus. Relaxin, as I mentioned, so relaxin is also secreted by the corpus luteum and then ultimately by the placenta. Peaks in the first trimester, just like HCG does. And as its name suggests, it relaxes certain things. So it relaxes the pubic symphysis, which can help expand the pelvic bowl. increases uterine distensibility. All right, so again, so it becomes more compliant. It synergizes with progesterone in stimulating multiplication of those decidual cells that contain a lot of glycogen that are needed for energy purposes. All right, and promotes both the growth of the blood vessels in the pregnant uterus as well. Okay, so that's a very sort of brief introduction to the fertilization and then implantation of the hormones that are involved in helping to maintain the pregnancy. Now, a couple of things in terms of the terms for pregnancy and childbirth, right? We have what we call gestation. So gestation is the pregnancy. And it lasts on average about 270 days. And that's from conception to childbirth. Now, usually when they measure it, they have what they call a gestational calendar. And so that's measured from the first day of the woman's last menstrual period. Okay? And so the birth is typically predicted from that to be about 280 days, which comes out to about 40 weeks. There's a range, anywhere between 38 to 40 weeks. All right, so oftentimes I'll speak about maybe 39 weeks. But yeah, so about 280 days is typical. All right, that's the predicted. And then the term, all right, term is just the duration of the pregnancy, and trimester. So I've already mentioned trimesters when I said the first trimester where the HCG levels peak. So these are really effectively three-month intervals. However, as you guys can probably do the math here, that's not exactly 9 months. We say 9 months, three-month intervals would be about 9 months, but it's more than that if you calculate 40 weeks worth. Parturition is the process of birth. Okay, so it's the mechanisms of labor and birth. So now conception is the beginning of parturition. All right, so that's the uterus is relaxed and the cervix remains tightly closed. All right, so with again cervix, that's the junction point between the uterus and the vagina. All right, and has what they call the cervical os, which is the communication between the vaginal canal and the uterus. And so that actually remains tightly closed with like a plug, what we call like a mucus plug, to prevent any sperm from being able to penetrate into the uterus after conception. And the uterus itself has to become relaxed to allow to accommodate the growing fetus. And so things like relaxin and estrogen, progesterone will play a role in that. Now the myometrium, all right, will remain relaxed, and the muscle cells will be disconnected from each other. So what this means is, again, if you recall, I said estrogen and progesterone have opposite actions when it comes to smooth muscle activity. Estrogen causes contraction and excitation. Progesterone, on the other hand, causes relaxation. So being that progesterone and estrogen levels are kind of rising together, progesterone's actions predominate, as I mentioned. So the myometrium, or the smooth muscles of the endometrium, will be relaxed. All right, and when we say disconnected, towards the end of pregnancy, they'll actually develop gap junctions to communicate electrically with one another so that you can have synchronized activity. But they lack gap junctions early on, so they can't create any kind of coordinated contractile patterns. Now, in the last 2 weeks of pregnancy, the myometrium becomes more excitable and increases in tension, and they develop those gap junctions. So what this means really is towards the end of pregnancy, estrogen, progesterone, as they're rising, the ratio of estrogen progesterone changes towards the end of pregnancy so that estrogen becomes more predominant. When that happens, the excitability of the myometrium increases. And it also, one of estrogen's jobs is to increase those gap junctions. And so this creates more excitable tissue that are all interconnected and create more of a coordinated activity. At the same time, the cervix will soften. That's the role of estrogen as well. So estrogen is making it more excitable. All right, it's going to be more coordinated, and the elevated estrogen levels relative to the progesterone levels is going to cause the cervix itself to soften. So the cervix is hard because it has a lot of collagen in it. It makes it more of a rigid structure. But then estrogen will actually increase enzymatic activity in the cervix and break down a lot of that collagen, and it starts to soften. And that's when it becomes more compliant, something we call effacement, which we'll talk about. Uterine contractions begin to become coordinated and stronger because of the interconnections between those smooth muscles, and then it's ultimately going to expel the fetus through the cervical canal as it's contracting in a coordinated fashion down towards the cervix. So how do we go from this relaxed to the contracted uterus? Well, I kind of mentioned a little bit already, but estrogen overcomes the relaxing effects of progesterone, all right, and stimulates uterine contractions. And so some of the mechanisms with which it's able to do this is that it increases the number of receptors for oxytocin on the smooth muscle. All right, so oxytocin receptor. So estrogen upregulates oxytocin receptors, and oxytocin, all right, is a contractile hormone. It's going to increase the contractility of these smooth muscles, and so that's going to be released in high amounts towards the end of pregnancy. And in fact, when the estrogen starts to soften the cervix and the cervix becomes stretched, that signal, the stretching of the cervix, actually signals the release from the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. And once it releases the oxytocin, it's going to cause contraction, that coordinated contraction of the myometrium of the end of the uterus. In addition, the estrogen also stimulates prostaglandin synthesis. Estrogen and oxytocin can both actually stimulate prostaglandin, PGF2 alpha. PGF2 alpha also can directly bind to receptors and cause an increase in contractility. So you have three players here. You have the estrogen, which is increasing that excitability and causing the gap junctions to form and softening the cervix. Once the cervix starts to stretch, oxytocin gets released. Oxytocin has been it acts very effectively because estrogen increased the density of its receptors on the uterus. And then the prostaglandin is also released in response to the oxytocin, and that also augments the effects of its contractility. The question, though, which is still unclear, is there a trigger for birth? At what point does it signal it's time to go? All right, when the body is ready to expel the fetus, and that's not really clear. They've found a few things that seem to correlate in terms of what goes up, what hormones go up at a particular time, but it's not definitively causal. So we don't know if it actually causes it or if it's just a result of something else. In any case, some of what they found was that the placental corticotropic releasing hormone. All right, this is the hormone that you should recognize from previous lectures that gets released from the hypothalamus to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. All right, so placenta can actually release corticotropic releasing hormone, and this can reduce the effect of progesterone. So it has the effect of basically nullifying some of the effect of the progesterone to allow estrogen in time to take over. And we also know that estrogen levels continue to rise, so that ratio gets offset. So we have increased estrogen levels relative to progesterone, and the progesterone becomes a little less sensitive, and so therefore estrogen can kind of take over. Again, the increasing estrogen levels and PGF2 alphas rise in the uterus, again in response to oxytocin. So these may all kind of go together, and so instead of a trigger, it might just happen to be various biological mechanisms all kind of coming together and maturing at the same time. Okay, so we have fetal cortisol also plays a role in the development, and fetal cortisol, this would be here during the 34th to 36th week of pregnancy. So around this time, this cortisol level is increasing. It's being secreted by the fetal adrenal glands, and partly that's in response to that CRH that I just mentioned that can be released from the placenta. The role of cortisol here is very important in that it increases surfactant in the lungs. All right, and surfactant, as we know, helps to keep the lungs open by reducing that surface tension in the alveoli. So it's very critical during that time period. So if a baby is born before the 34th week, they may not be producing enough surfactant and may not be able to open up their lungs. In addition, the cortisol increases glycogen stores. Now, we talked about cortisol and its role of breaking down glycogen to increase gluconeogenesis and glucose in the blood, but it seems to also increase glycogen stores, so it's maintaining a ratio of storage to breakdown. And so here it's increasing glycogen stores in the fetal liver. This is important for postpartum nutrition, since that's going to be a very stressful time during the birthing process. Requires a lot of nutrition, and so it's storing up some glycogen for that. Now, estrogen, as we know, as it's increasing, is going to increase uterine contractions, increases oxytocin receptors, as I mentioned, on the smooth muscles. All right, it also increases them on the mammary glands, which I didn't mention yet, but the mammary glands, so the breast tissue, and that's the oxytocin's role there is going to be to cause contraction of the glands to release the milk when the baby is suckling. Increases gap junctions between the smooth muscles, which increases its excitability and the coordination between the smooth muscles. And again, helps to soften that cervix with prostaglandin synthesis that breaks down that collagen that we were talking about before. PGF2 alpha, estrogen and oxytocin stimulate its release, and this system helps to augment and stimulate that uterine contraction, as I mentioned. The oxytocin All right, again, uterine contraction. So its effect is enhanced by increased concentrations of oxytocin and numbers of receptors. Those receptors were enhanced by the effect of estrogen throughout pregnancy. And it's secreted by the pituitary of the mother and the fetus prior to birth, so they both release it. All right, and directly stimulates contraction via release of PGF2 alpha. Okay, so this is the mechanism with which it's able to increase its contraction. Okay, now in terms of adjustments to pregnancy, so up until this point, these are really the hormones at play at the very end during parturition. I kind of talked about estrogen's role and how it's increasing excitability and gap junctions and helping to maintain that endometrial lining. And progesterone plays the role of making sure everything kind of stays relaxed until the right moment, right? And then maybe that CRH gets released from the placenta, which helps to kind of offset the role of progesterone, and it helps estrogens to kind of take over and increases excitability at the appropriate moments. Okay. Now during pregnancy, there's a lot of different, since a lot of hormones are in play, there's a lot of different adjustments that are made. So for example, in the endocrine system, the pituitary gland, since it plays a major role through this whole process, it's being stimulated quite a bit and grows up to 50% larger. Okay, produces increased levels of thyroid stimulating hormone, prolactin, and ACTH. So ACTH helps to stimulate some of that cortisol, which helps to mobilize some of those fats and glucose that's needed for these very metabolic processes. Thyroid, of course, can help to adjust the levels of our basal metabolic rate, because now that has to increase accordingly. And prolactin, it's going to work on the breast tissue and ultimately for milk production after the pregnancy. Thyroid gland becomes 50% larger because of the TSH increase as well. All right. Aldosterone. So aldosterone secretion does rise during pregnancies, promotes fluid retention. So pregnant women do get more fluid retention, increases the mother's blood volume, which can also, you would think, bring up that blood pressure as well. So it's essentially what's happening is estrogen is acting on the liver to increase levels of angiotensinogen. So here's another role for estrogen. So estrogen acts on the liver to increase the release of angiotensinogen, which is part of that renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So releasing more angiotensinogen results in more aldosterone. More aldosterone results in an increase in sodium reabsorption in water and so on. Now you'd expect that to cause a large increase in a mother's blood pressure. However, it doesn't usually, because it's offset by progesterone's actions on smooth muscles in the vasculature by reducing the effectiveness of norepinephrine and angiotensin 2 on smooth muscles of the vasculature, which helps to reduce that resistance. So the digestive system. So the digestive system, you might have heard morning sickness, so things like nausea, especially arising from bed in the first few months of gestation during that first trimester. Cause is not clear. All right, but you also see things like constipation, heartburn. Part of that is due to reduced intestinal motility, maybe due to the levels of progesterone. Pressure on the stomach causing reflux of gastric contents. Progesterone also relaxes the sphincter, the esophageal sphincters. So the lower esophageal sphincter, if that becomes relaxed, that's going to allow more acid reflux, which part of that's due mechanically due to the enlarging fetus, but also because the progesterone's a relaxing effect on all these smooth muscles, which includes smooth muscles of the GI system. In terms of metabolism, as I mentioned, the basal metabolic rate is going to have to rise in response to the new demand. So an increase in thyroid hormone, for example, this increases their appetite, which means that an increase in appetite, if they're eating more, they will have some weight gain. And so the average healthy weight gain for pregnant females is between 25 and 35 pounds. Okay, in terms of the circulatory system, so the mother's blood volume rises, so we can kind of predict that from the aldosterone that we talked about earlier. All right, it rises about 40%, so that's a very large volume during pregnancy. Again, due to fluid retention and some hemopoiesis, because you're going to be producing more cells. And mother has about 1 to 2 liters of extra blood, so that's a fairly large increase in blood volume. The cardiac output rises 30 to 40% above normal. Larger volume means larger stroke volumes and so on. and there can be also an increase in the heart rate, so the cardiac output can go up significantly. But like I said, we know that blood pressure is related to cardiac output and the total peripheral resistance, and progesterone has a sort of relaxing effect on the resistance, and so that can kind of offset that, so the blood pressure really shouldn't rise very much at all during pregnancy. Okay. Pregnant uterus puts pressure on the large pelvic blood vessels. So just mechanically, just compressing your blood vessels, this can interfere with venous return from the legs. And since the veins are not high pressure systems, they can kind of get backed up. This can result in hemorrhoids, so swelling of the blood vessels, and varicose veins and edema of the feet and so on. So these are complications of. In terms of the respiratory system, so tidal volume and minute ventilation increase about 40%. So there is an increase in respiratory rate. And so the two reasons for this are, one, the oxygen demand rises in proportion to the woman's increase in metabolic rate, okay, and the needs of the fetus. So it has to match now for the fetus as well as their own elevated BMR. Progesterone increases the sensitivity of the woman's chemoreceptors to carbon dioxide. So this is a direct effect of progesterone. So this actually kind of lowers the threshold of their chemoreceptors to carbon dioxide. So pregnant females tend to have a lower PaCO2. So their arterial CO2 content tends to be lower, and this triggers because it's triggering their ventilation. So other things you'll see, some mothers may feel what they call air hungry from sensitivity to the CO2, and also from pressure on the diaphragm of the growing fetus. As the fetus gets larger, it's pushing a lot of the abdominal contents aside and also pushing up on the diaphragm. And as we know, the diaphragm is a primary mover for respiration. So when that becomes slightly obstructed, it can feel very difficult to breathe, right? Now, they tend to breathe more easily in the last month of pregnancy, usually because of pelvic expansion. Remember, the relaxant is going to help relax the pelvic bowl there, and then the fetus can drop lower and sit lower in the pelvis, and that takes pressure off the diaphragm. All right, and then that helps the diaphragm to move more easily and helps them to breathe a little bit more easily. The urinary system. So I already mentioned aldosterone, okay? So water retention and salt retention. The GFR will increase because, and your urine output is usually, elevated. So this allows, the woman to dispose both of her own byproducts as well as the fetus's metabolic waste. In addition, mechanically, a growing fetus, because this is a very large mass that's growing here, can compress pelvic structures as well, and that includes the bladder. So that can reduce the bladder's capacity, so they might have more frequent urinations, some uncontrollable leakage of urine, or some incontinence, as we call it. And then in the integumentary system, so again, as this mass, as the fetus is growing, all right, it's going to be stretching the skin. So the skin's going to have to grow to accommodate the expansion of the abdomen as well as also of the breasts. And so we get sometimes some stria or stretch marks that can result from tearing due to the growth. All right, basically overstretched connective tissue. Added fat deposition in the hips and thighs, again due to higher levels of estrogen and so on. This also triggers some melanocyte activity, which can increase in certain areas of the body. So we can sometimes see that in the darkening of the areolae around the nipples, as well as in the linea alba, or sometimes referred to as the linea nigra, which you can see in the picture down here. Okay. Temporary blotching, darkening of the skin over the nose and cheeks, which you can kind of see. So that looks like this. All right. Sometimes referred to as the mask of pregnancy or chloasma. Okay, so in terms of nutrition, the placenta will actually store large amounts of nutrients early in gestation and save them for the last trimester. In the last trimester, there's almost an exponential amounts of growth occurring and requires very high amounts of nutrients. And so the placenta will help to release those nutrients at that time. And the demand is especially high for things like protein, iron, calcium, and phosphates. So typically the woman will also need extra iron during late pregnancy. Now, vitamin K, this is given in late pregnancy and to the newborn to promote prothrombin synthesis. Remember, we have certain factors that are vitamin K dependent, and so this is going to help minimize the risk of neonatal hemorrhage. Because remember, during the birthing process, especially vaginal deliveries, it can be quite a traumatic event, and so we want to make sure that they have appropriate amount of clotting synthesis, particularly when it comes to protecting the brain. Vitamin D, so supplements help ensure adequate calcium absorption to meet the fetal demand. All right, and then folic acid Folic acid reduces the risk of neurological fetal disorders like spina bifida or anencephaly. In fact, you can see the picture over to the right, where you see part of the cranial vault in the brain is missing. Anencephaly, that would be due to folic acid deficiency. Okay, so the process of childbirth. So in the 7 months of gestation, all right, the fetus normally turns into this head down position, something we refer to as the vertex position. And so most babies are going to be born head down. All right, so we call, again, refer to that as the vertex position. And you can see that, okay, you see that over here in the cartoon there. And this, what I like about this particular cartoon is it gives you an idea of essentially how large, right, this fetus here, this baby has become, this neonate here. All right, you see head down, and you see how much the uterus has had to expand. You can even see how the small intestine, the descending and ascending colon have been kind of pushed off to the side, and that can push up on the diaphragm and so on. So it's not surprising that there's digestive issues and urinary issues that accompany pregnancy, particularly as the fetus grows. Now, it seems this is obvious, but we always have to say this though. The fetus is physically passive during the birthing process, right? What that's just saying is that it's not going to be kicking out with its legs. It's not going to be moving its arms to help you out in any way, or at least not anything that's conducive to helping you get the baby out. So it is physically passive, but it's not chemically passive. Because remember, it's also going to be releasing oxytocin, which can help stimulate contractions and so on. So it can be chemically active with its own hormones, but physically, no. All right. So expulsion is going to be achieved by the contraction of the mother's uterine and abdominal muscles. Right. So again, that's like coordinated contractions that's carried out by the hormones that we talked about previously. The fetus again will play a chemical stimulating role, right, to help stimulate labor contractions. And it also helps to send chemical messages signify when it's developed enough to be born. So this is that interplay of hormones that we talked about, like what is the trigger? It's not really known, but there's changes in the levels of the hormones and the interactions of the receptors and so on that, you know, when the fetus is really kind of developed enough, will be mature enough, and then that will be start to give the signals for labor. In terms of labor, so we have labor contractions. All right, they begin about typically 30 minutes apart. So this is when we're starting to increase that excitability, and they eventually will occur between 1 and 3 minutes. So they start to the lapse between them is less and less. Now they periodically relax to increase blood flow and oxygen delivery to the placenta and fetus. So this is just a reminder that contracting muscles, they tend to compress blood vessels, so there's no good blood flow through a contracting muscle. But when they relax, blood can flow. All right, because when they contract, it's high resistance, so there's not much flow. So we don't want it to just contract and hold, because that's going to cause ischemia of the tissue, right? It still needs the blood flow. So that's why it's a contraction, and then it's a relaxation to allow flow, and then contraction again. And so the contractions are typically strongest at the fundus, and the fundus is at the top, okay, where the feet would be, okay? And it's also referred to as like the body, so the fundus would be in the body, and so they'll contract sort of more forcefully downward. And that would make sense because you're trying to expel the fetus through the cervical canal. So you'd want the contractions to start up top and generate more force, pushing downward. We have one of those rare positive feedback loops. All right, we saw that with blood clotting. We see it here with, during the birthing process. So what happens is when the signals are ready and there's an increase in excitability, and you're getting contraction of, say, the fundus, and the body is pushing the fetus downward and the head towards that cervical canal. The cervix, remember, is softening because of the estrogen. It's breaking up that collagen. And so what's happening now is it's going to start to push down on that cervix, flattening it and stretching it out, and stretching out that cervical canal. And in stretching the cervical canal, there's actually a signal from the cervix that goes to the posterior pituitary that causes the release of oxytocin. That oxytocin, of course, is going to bind to the myometrial muscles of the uterus and increase its contractility. And once it does that, it increases contractility, it pushes the head down further, which stretches the cervix even more. That increase in stretch causes more oxytocin to be released. So this is the positive feedback loop. As long as the cervix continues to get stretched, more oxytocin gets released to compress more, which is only going to further stretch it until there's actually until the baby moves into the vaginal canal and the cervix can actually stop being stretched, and the signal stops. So that's why this is a positive feedback loop up until the cervix stops stretching. And so you see that in the cartoon here, where you see nerve impulses from the cervix transmitted to the brain. Brain stimulates the pituitary to secrete oxytocin. Oxytocin in the blood to the uterus, stimulates the uterus contraction, pushes the baby towards cervix. Head pushes against the cervix, stretches it, more nerve impulses, and so on. In terms of the pain of labor, mainly due to ischemia of the myometrium. So again, as I said, when muscle contracts, it can compress blood vessels, and that can reduce flow to those organs. And so you can get a little bit of ischemia that occurs, and ischemia can induce nerve fibers to sense pain. So muscles hurt, for example, when they're deprived of blood. Contractions can restrict that circulation. So this can be some of that pain. As the fetus enters the vagina, the pain actually becomes stronger because you have stretching of the cervix, the vagina, and the perineum. All right, sometimes the perineum can actually tear a little bit. Now, an episiotomy is a procedure which may be necessary. It's not always used, but it may be necessary. And this is an incision in the vulva, all right, which is the opening to the vaginal canal there, to widen the vaginal orifice to prevent random tearing. So you're basically giving a nice clean cut to allow something to heal better and move more easily, to prevent, sort of a random tearing occurring somewhere else where the healing might take much longer. So the 3 stages of labor are dilatation, expulsion, and the placental stage. Now, all of these stages tend to be longer than what we call the premipara. And the premipara is just somebody, just a woman who's giving birth for the first time. And they tend to be shorter in the multipara, somebody who's previously given birth. Okay, so the first stage of labor is dilatation. Longest stage, the timing of it's quite variable, again, depending on multipara, premipara, and some other factors as well. But that can last anywhere from 8 to 24 hours. And dilatation of the cervical canal. So as it's widening open, tend to be about 10 centimeters is what they're looking for, because that's going to be the size of the fetal head typically. And then effacement. So effacement is just the thinning of the cervix. Remember, it's softening because of that estrogen. So as it softens and the head's getting pushed against it, it can kind of flatten, and then the cervical canal can open. So we call the flattening of it, or the thinning of the cervix, effacement. All right, and dilatation is the opening of that canal up to 10 centimeters. During this time, at some point, you're going to have a rupture of the fetal membranes and loss of that amniotic fluid. This is oftentimes referred to as the breaking of the waters. So in the expulsion stage, so this is where the head is now moved from the cervical canal and is now in the vagina, and ultimately from the vagina, it's when the baby is actually completely expelled. And this can take anywhere from about 30 to 60 minutes, typically in a premipara, but in multipara it can be much faster. This is where you're going to see crowning. So this is when the baby's head is actually visible. And delivery of the head is commonly the most difficult part, simply because of the rigid structure and it's the largest. But after expulsion, the attendant then usually drains the blood from the umbilical vein. Those who drain it directly into the baby, they'll clamp it, and then the umbilical cord is then cut. The last, which is called the placental stage, this is where uterine contractions will continue even though the baby has been expelled, because they're trying to separate the placenta from the uterine lining. And so that's what you see in the cartoon now, where the uterus continues to contract and the placenta is coming off the wall there. So this is the placenta plus any of the membranes, and so all that should be expelled. All right. So this is commonly referred to as the afterbirth, and it's inspected. So the placenta is collected and inspected to be sure everything has been expelled appropriately. And then finally, we talk about lactation. So after birth, lactation can then ensue. As I've mentioned, hormones help to develop the breast and the breast tissues and the glandular tissue and so on. But it's non-functioning in terms of breastfeeding until after the birth, because progesterone and estrogen inhibit the actions of prolactin in producing the milk. So lactation is the synthesis and ejection of milk from the mammary gland. All right, and it can last as little as 1 to 2 weeks in women who don't breastfeed. So again, not all women will breastfeed, some will bottle feed. If they choose to only strictly bottle feed and not breastfeed, then yes, the lactation will only last for about 1 to 2 weeks before it won't produce any more milk. And this actually can continue if the baby does breastfeed and it suckles regularly. This nursing infant could continue to do so for several years. In fact, they found that traditionally, women nurse their infants up to about 2.8 years. Okay. And I also note here that a breast pump can also be used to collect milk, and a breast pump would have the same actions like a nursing, of a nursing baby, and so therefore pumps can continue to stimulate milk production. Okay, so as I mentioned, estrogen has its effects on the growth of the mammary glands. It helps those ducts to grow. Also stimulates prolactin release. And then the prolactin is then released and also helps with the development of the breast and can produce milk, but it's inhibited during the pregnancy because of progesterone and estrogen. SOMATOMAMMOTROPIN, as I mentioned earlier, kind of acts like this prolactin, also stimulates breast growth and so on. So there's quite a few that kind of work synergistically. And progesterone, again, helps with development and inhibits that milk production. Seems to be one of the primary hormones in inhibiting that milk production by prolactin. All right, so colostrum and milk synthesis. So at birth, the prolactin secretion gradually decreases. So prolactin actually increases throughout the pregnancy. And you can see that in the graph, the cartoon here. So that black line there, that vertical line there represents the time of birth. So prolactin levels were increasing, which you can see from that little hill there. And then it gradually decreases after birth. And you can see here, in between the spikes there, that's that sort of plateau there that you see. So it's decreased, but it's not below pre-pregnancy levels. So it's still higher than pre-pregnancy levels. However, every time the infant nurses, the prolactin levels will jump 10 to 20 times their normal level for about an hour or so. And that's what you're seeing with these spikes. So every time there's been any kind of nursing, that's triggering this stimulation here. And prolactin levels will rise sharply. Okay. And so this stimulates synthesis of milk for the next feeding. So it helps to synthesize that and store more of the milk. However, without nursing, the milk production stops in 1 to 2 weeks, as I mentioned. All right, so the hormone levels drop lower and lower. And then, only 5 to 10% of women become pregnant while breastfeeding. So it does serve this, what kind of figures like an evolutionary process, in that it helps to prevent getting pregnant while breastfeeding. And the reason is that these high levels of prolactin actually inhibit gonadotropin releasing hormone, which reduces FSH and LH to stimulate the ovarian cycles and so on. And so this is actually shown to be a natural means of spacing out births. So as long as they continue to breastfeed, that lowers their risk for a pregnancy. And so you can see these spiking patterns over there on the graph. Now the ejection of the milk. So the milk's being produced by that prolactin. And again, the prolactin is able to do so because after the baby is born, the estrogen progesterone levels drop because once the placenta has been removed, which is producing all that estrogen and progesterone, then it no longer can inhibit the prolactin. So milk is continually secreted to the mammary acini, but does not easily flow into the ducts. So it's being produced and essentially stored there, but doesn't actually go into the ducts. The milk ejection, so to move them into the ducts and actually move them out of the ducts and out of the nipple, that's requires what we call a neuroendocrine reflex, and that's due to the infant's suckling. So infant suckling stimulates the sensory receptors in the nipple, and this signals the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. So oxytocin's role here is to stimulate the myoepithelial cells, so these smooth muscle cells that surround these glands around each of the acini, and it basically contracts those acini to squeeze the milk out of them and into the ducts so that they can be ejected. So they contract to squeeze the milk duct, and then milk starts to flow typically within 30 to 60 seconds after the suckling has begun.